A well-respected Roman Catholic priest was nearing his retirement, and he was telling an interfaith gathering of colleagues his odyssey. Odyssey is the story of one's soul's journey. As this priest shared some of the twists and turns of his life and ministry, everyone was riveted, for the story had been impressive on all counts. Just as he was nearing the end, he concluded by shocking his colleagues. He said, "My life in large part has been a failure." He said he had high hopes of how his generation of liberal priests might change the church to which he had devoted his life. And yet he had to admit, all these years later, the church he had hoped to change had become even more rigid and conservative. The dreams he had for most of his adult life and his ministry had not been realized. His colleagues were stunned by his revelation. At the conclusion of the priest's presentation, one of his colleagues observed that despite the expression of pain and disappointment that had been shared in the story, the priest seemed at ease, the same peaceful guy they had known for years. The colleague asked him, "Father, how can you claim that your life was a failure and yet appear so calm and serene?" "I know whose I am," replied the priest. "I know whose I am." I heard this story at a UU ministers gathering during which we were asked to consider our answers to the question, "Whose am I?" A question that we may not be in the habit of asking, but a question that, once answered, can reveal a great deal about what matters most in our lives and how we might best navigate the present and the future. Whose am I is a question that, once answered, can help us know where to place our hearts and minds when life gets wacky or disappointing or even tragic, or we feel adrift. At its heart, the question, "Whose am I?" is asking us, who or what do we serve beyond ourselves? To whom or to what are we accountable? What draws us out of our individual preoccupations and self-interest? What are the relationships, principles, and understandings that claim us and that in turn determine who we may become? So whose am I is a theological question. It's a question of how we find and make meaning. It's a question rooted in relationship and possibility. It's also a question at the heart of what it means to be in covenant with others and, in a sense, with ourselves. In our Soul Matters groups this month, we are considering the question, what does it mean to be a community of covenant? In next week's services, I'll consider the foundational role of covenant in our Unitarian Universalist practice of religion. Today, though, I will mostly invite you to consider your answers to the question, whose am I? In a sense, you get to write this sermon. What are the relationships and principles that energize you, that make a claim on you, that even at times confound you, but to whom you are bound nonetheless? To whom or to what do you already have commitments and promises about how you are going to be in relationship? Whose am I can feel like an odd question at first. We're more familiar with answering the question, who am I? But whose am I is a different and more powerful question. I appreciate how Douglas Steer, a Quaker teacher and author, describes the distinction. He says, to ask whose am I is to extend the question far beyond the little self-absorbed self and wonder who needs you, who loves you, to whom are you accountable, to whom do you answer, whose life is altered by your choices, whose life, whose lives is your own all bound up with inextricably in obvious or invisible ways. Now you should have received a blank piece of paper in your order of service. There's an important flyer about caring ministry, which I want you to see too, but there's a blank page that's important for right now. And you should have received or been offered a pencil when you entered. If you do not have something to write with, won't you raise your hand, and we have some ushers that will be willing to bring you paper or pencil. What do you need, Ed? Both. So we need paper and pencil down front, and we need paper and pencil here. Looks like there's a few in the back. I'm going to talk at you for a while these get distributed. We're not going to do the activity quite yet. Keep your hands raised if you need something. So the exercise we're going to share in is one that's found in this month's Soul Matters packet. So some of you may have already given it a try. And that's okay. I find that each time I do it, I respond a little differently, and I learn something new. So I trust the same will happen for you. If you're curious about exercises like this and would want to be a part of a small group that does things like this and then talks about it, Soul Matters is for you. You can let Tracy Beck or Laura Berardi or me know of your interest in getting in a group, and we'll try to help you. So this exercise that we're going to share reminds me of one I shared with my colleagues many years ago. We were asked to find a partner, someone in the room that we could talk with, and we were asked to sit in front of each other. And following a facilitator's instructions, my partner asked me, "Whose are you?" I answered, "I am my family's, my wife, my daughter's." Per instructions, my partner then offered a blessing, responding, "God be merciful." And then she asked me again, "Whose are you?" I answered, "My extended family, my brother, my sister, my father, his wife, my nieces, my nephews, my in-laws." "God be merciful. Whose are you?" "Well, the congregation I serve, the people who have called me to minister to them." "God be merciful. Whose are you?" For several minutes, this exchange continued. After the obvious relationship to family, to friends, to work, I listed in short phrases acknowledgement of all the relationships that are essential to my life, confirming in the process the reality and the significance of the connections that make me who I am and that impact who I will become. I spoke of people and ideas that one way or another lay claim to my heart and to my life. Not all of these relationships rolled right off my tongue. Sometimes there was silence before I articulated yet another connection. But the blessing response of my partner, by design, was always the same. "God be merciful," she said. So the spirit of the exercise we will now share is the same, except I'm not going to have you partner up, because the logistics of that would be a nightmare. Instead, I want you to write or draw your answers to the question, "Whose am I?" rather than say them aloud. So if you take your piece of paper, and you can do it either way you want, this way or this way, and put it on a hymnal or something so you have something to write on. And I want you to write me, M-E, in the center. And then, as though I am sitting directly across from you, imagine me asking, "Whose are you?" And in response, I want you to write down people, principles, values, whatever you're committed to. And you can draw lines of connection, creating a kind of mind map of the network of covenant that you already live in. Maybe some of the answers you're going to write down are bigger than others. Maybe some are related to other answers and you can connect them with lines and circles. Maybe you don't yet know how the answers connect. Be at peace with whatever you find yourself writing. Trust there will be truth in everything you write, even if it's incomplete. Each time you write a new answer revealing yet another connection, you can imagine me offering a blessing to you. You can imagine me saying, "God be merciful," or whatever idea of the holy resonates for you. So we're going to take a good 5 minutes or so to work on this in silence. Whose are you? God be merciful. How often do we take the time to reflect upon and name the relationships that actually define us, the connections that make us who we are? When I experienced this exercise as a vocal exchange with another person, and my partner in her turn listed the relationships that define her life and help her determine her commitments, I could see in her searching eyes and her furrowed brow the kind of focused engagement I recognized as my own. To hear my partner name the connections to whom she belonged, though different in some ways from those I had spoken, I heard my own voice. If you could have seen your faces as you wrote down your connections just now, I'm guessing that it would have been in some ways like seeing your own face. For as Martin Luther King Jr. put it, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. When you look at the map that you created, incomplete though it may be, what stands out for you? What surprises you? what may be missing. 5 minutes on a Sunday morning isn't really enough time to give this adequate attention, but hopefully it opened a door for you to reflect. So I encourage you to take your map home and continue to reflect on it. I also encourage you, as you feel so moved, to talk about it with others, sharing your discoveries, your surprises, so we can learn together. You see, if we won't engage the question of whose are we as individuals and to whom we ultimately belong beyond ourselves, how will we know when we as a community in covenant can act collectively? How will we discern that which is of most importance to our collective lives as one human family? Without some kind of grounding in an understanding that we belong to something beyond our individual selves, important though we are, what will motivate us to come together when we most need to? Around what will we gather if we cannot recognize that we do have mutual relationships, some mutual loves that provide the network of mutuality for any meaningful work we will ever collectively do? You see, one way or another, if we are to help create and live in a community of covenant, especially a community like this church, we're going to have to answer for ourselves, whose am I? As a springboard to discern together if there's enough similarity in our answers to determine whose we are. Because you can count on it, any community of covenant will be faced with decision points when we have to answer, whose are we? And these decision points arrive all the time. They arrive each time we have to consider whether or not to offer our support to a needed, though potentially controversial movement, say like Black Lives Matter. They arrive when we have the opportunity to share our space with homeless families through a partnership with an organization like Family Promise. They arrive each winter when we have our budget drive at church and we decide how much of our financial abundance we will share for the coming year. They arrive when we are asked to determine our own ministries in this congregation, to commit to how we are going to share our time and talent to being open to life, expecting to love, and prepared to serve. They even arrive when a former member or current member is disgruntled with our community, and we must determine how best to respond. The truth is that the question, whose are we, is a question at the heart of our individual lives and the organizations we care about. It's a question of covenant. Whose are we? Much depends on our answers, both our health as individuals and the health of our communities. God be merciful indeed.